All right, well, if you have a Bible, go ahead and open up to 2 Corinthians chapter 8. If you're just joining with us, jumping in, we've been working through 2 Corinthians all this year, since January. We finished up 1 Corinthians last year, and it's been a really fruitful study, and so most of these messages are online. If you've missed out, you want to go catch up, you can do that. But I want you, as we start tonight, I want you to try to remember an awkward moment where you were enjoying your relationship with someone, only to figure out at some point they were only really interested in you for financial reasons. Probably all have had an experience like this, maybe with a friend or someone we thought was a friend. For Jenna and I, early in our marriage, we did one of those timeshare vacation packages. Anybody ever fallen into one of those? Some people love them. That was our first and last, but some of you will be able to relate to this. You know, you're newly married. You've got very little extra money for vacation. Someone tells you about this deal where you can go to some beach resort for free. You know, it comes with a coupon for a nice dinner. And you get there and, you know, everybody's just being so kind to you. Oh, let me carry your bags, Mr. Presley. And right this way, Mr. Presley. Would you like a warm cookie, Mr. Presley? And you're like, this is amazing, right? We're being treated like royalty and this is free. No strings attached. Yeah, no strings attached, except for the 3-hour sales pitch you're going to have to sit through. And you don't think you can politely say, not interested one time and then excuse yourself back to the pool, right? No, you're going to have to say no 50 times, at least to 3 different people, all of whom have mastered the face of, how dare you, you ungrateful cheapskate. So after 2 hours of saying no several times to the first guy and then several times to his boss and then several times to her boss, I literally pulled out my Excel spreadsheet and told the final boss man that if he could find $450 extra in my budget somewhere, I'd gladly redirect it towards, you know, his timeshare. And he actually, I kid you not, pointed to my tithing line item and said, well, what about right here? What if you redirected this for a while and just thought of it as being generous to yourself? Well, in chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, Paul seems worried that the Corinthians are going to feel about him the same way that I felt about the timeshare guy. Wait a minute, Paul. You mean this whole time, all this God loves you and I love you, all of this has really been, you need us to pay your bills, right? Paul, he kind of gets this worry that this is what the Corinthians are going to think. So in chapter 8, Paul kind of seeks to diffuse that. Now, if you remember, Paul's already explained that he doesn't take a personal salary from any money he collects from the church. He raises that on his own with a part-time job. You remember Paul was a tent maker. The money he's collecting from the churches, he's using to help alleviate the needs of poor believers around the world. But still, Paul knows that talking about money in a group setting like this makes people nervous, right? We all know that's true, right? It's like, oh man, all the church does is talk about money. It gets everybody a little nervous. And everyone's nervous because they think that any money talk is going to end with a guilt trip where you sit across the table from some high-pressure salesman who has perfected his how dare you face. So Paul, right out of the gate, in verse 8 of chapter 8, look at what he says. He says, I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. Paul says, in other words, I'm taking the God card off the table, right? I'm not giving you any commands here. In fact, in chapter 9, which we'll get to in several weeks, Paul says, each one must give as he has decided in his heart. This is chapter 9, verse 7. Not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful or a willing giver. Paul is saying, if what I'm saying about generosity doesn't excite you, I'm not talking to you. God's only interested in cheerful, enthusiastic givers. That's the only kind of givers God wants, because God doesn't approach us with needs. Generosity is not about what we give to God. Generosity is about what we receive from God. So I I want all of us just to breathe a little bit tonight, a little sigh of relief. Paul didn't give his instructions here in chapter 8 in the spirit of a command. So I'm not going to do that either tonight. And so that means if you're worried about tonight ending with me making you feel guilty about not giving, I just want to take that off the table. I want to say this is the question then for the night. If for Paul, talking about generosity is not primarily about collecting money to meet needs, then what is it about? What's it about? Well, I think he identifies 3 reasons that he wants the Corinthians to be generous, and they have nothing to do with his personal needs. 3 reasons he wants the Corinthians to be generous that have nothing to do with his personal needs. He is concerned first that they have the right response to grace. This is point number 1 tonight if you're taking notes, that they have the right response to grace. Generosity is about having the right response to God's grace. Look at verse 7 of chapter 8 with me. He says, but as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, and in our love for you, see that you excel in this act of grace also. Jump down to verse 9. He says, for you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. Grace towards others is the right response to experiencing the grace of God towards you. That's what Paul's saying. Grace towards others is the right response to experiencing the grace of God towards you. This is interesting. Paul uses the word grace more in these 2 chapters, chapter 8 and chapter 9. He uses this word grace more times than in all of his other New Testament writings combined. That's a little bit surprising, actually, but it's true. Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament. And did you know that in these 2 chapters, even though he's talking about generosity, he's talking about giving, Paul never once uses the word for money. He didn't use the word for money, not one time. Because the focus of these chapters is not money. That's not the focus. It's on grace and the kind of instinctive generosity that grace creates in the hearts of all who have genuinely experienced it and received it. So the climactic verse is verse 9. He says, you know the grace of the Lord Jesus, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. So think about this for a moment. Paul says, Jesus' generosity to you. That should be the focus. Where would you be had Jesus not died for you? Where would you be had Jesus not left the comforts of heaven and poured out all of his riches on you? Like, think on that for a moment. Let that, Paul says, shape how you approach your life, your stuff, your resources. He left heaven voluntarily, entered into you and I's poverty, and he not only sympathized with us in it, he actually took our place under it so that he could bring us the riches of heaven. Like Paul's saying, does that not do anything in your heart? Like how could you have an experience of grace that large and it not produce a change in your heart? Imagine on Sunday, this coming Sunday, imagine that Pastor Jeremy got in here on this stage up to the pulpit like 5 minutes late. Like the worship has ended, the prayer is prayed, the pulpit gets brought out, the lights come up for the sermon, but no Jeremy, no Pastor Jeremy. And everybody's like looking around going, all right, what are we going to do? Like, where is he? It's a little bit awkward. The sound AV team in the back are kind of losing their minds. Like, oh, did we miss a cue? What's going on? Those that have him on Life 360 are pulling it up, looking for him. And his family stands up and it's like, hey, he's on the premises, and it's like, he's here somewhere. Well, let's say like 5 minutes pass by and he finally walks out onto the stage and he says, hey, church, I'm so sorry. You're not going to believe this, but like I was walking into church over by the 405 doors this morning, and I looked up right above me as one of the roofers was hoisting up a bunch of heavy roofing material on a pallet. And just as I happened to look up on the roof, the guy who was using the lift, he just like tipped it over on top of me, and the pallet dropped 15 feet and smashed me 5 feet into the pavement. And I was like Wile E. Coyote, right? Dusted myself off and got in here as quick as I could. We'd say, Pastor Jeremy, we love you, but you're lying, right? Like if you got hit with that kind of force, you'd look, you'd walk, you'd smile different. Well, Paul's saying if you've been hit by the force of the gospel, every part of you will be different. And so Paul says, verse 7, why would your wallet, your pocketbook be the only place not radically touched by the knowledge in all earnestness? Why wouldn't you excel in this grace, in this gospel? He says you excel in faith, in speech, in grace also. Jesus told us in Matthew chapter 6 that what you do with your money is the most reliable indicator about where your heart actually is. You see, it's really easy to talk a big game when it comes to faith. But what Jesus was saying in Matthew 6 is that your level of your generosity will always reveal the truth of what's really going on in here. You guys remember, you remember back into the COVID days, right? Wasn't that long ago. It's going by fast, but you remember those days, right? You remember everywhere you went, you had to do those symptom screening tests, especially like at the airport, or like you went to big events, get on a plane, and they'd take your temperature, and like they'd have you answer all the questions, like, hey, have you had a cough? Have you had a fever? All these things. And, you just got out of a hot car, you ate something spicy, and it raised your temperature and triggered a false positive. And they actually even had something called white coat syndrome, where you get anxious about being tested, and that caused you to demonstrate COVID-like symptoms and made you test positive. There were a lot of false positives during those COVID days. Well, there's a lot of false positives when it comes to the Christian life. Talking about your faith, knowing a lot about the Bible, coming to church, living in a moral way, all of those can be false positives. Jesus says the true measure of what's really going on in here is what you do with your money. So here's the question. What if we measured our walk with God not by how high we raise our hands in worship or how often we come to church, but simply by what we did with our money? What if we pulled out our bank statement and said, okay, let's figure out what's most important to us? What does our statement show we treasure the most and trust the most? Because right here, our mouth doesn't always give an accurate picture. But what Jesus is saying is your bank statement usually does. One of the reasons that Jenna and I strive to make our biggest transaction every month, our giving, bigger than even our mortgage, is we want our bank statement to declare that Jesus is the most important to us. And we haven't always been able to do that. But the last 3 years we're seeking to continue to do that because our spiritual home, our spiritual life is more important than our physical life and our physical home. Oh, our physical home is important. It's very important, but Jesus is more important. We have strived by God's grace to excel, as Paul says, in this act of grace also. And I don't say that to brag by any means, but just to say that this is something God is doing in us too. So Paul wants them to grow in generosity. He wants them, number 2, to experience an increase in joy. Jump back up to the first part of chapter 8. He wants them to experience an increase in joy. He says, we want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. This these churches that Paul speaks of in Macedonia. These were another batch of churches that Paul had planted in northern Greece. If you read the letters of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, those letters were written to these churches. And Paul, he says that they were in a severe test of affliction. But yet, look at the end of verse 2. Their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So look at this. Paul says these Macedonian churches were in extreme poverty. And the word he used for extreme means as deep as the ocean. In other words, they weren't just poor, they were PO. They couldn't even afford the OR, right? This is how poor and poverty-stricken they were. And yet, Paul says their response was a wealth of generosity, which means, verse 3, it means that they gave not only according to their means, but even beyond their means. Literally, verse 4, they begged for the favor of taking part in helping the poor believers in Jerusalem. And in doing this, they experienced, Paul said in verse 2, an abundance of joy. Which, by the way, this shatters a couple of myths people often believe about generosity. It just shatters them. Myth 1, only rich people can be generous. This shatters that myth. Myth 2, only rich people can be happy. These people are poor, and yet they're generous. These people are poor, and yet they have an abundance of joy. We have a church that is in extreme poverty, and yet also really generous and really happy. So let's talk for a minute about myth 1, that only rich people can be generous. And let me talk. I know we've got a variety of ages in this room. Let me talk specifically to the young adults, and I'll let you decide if you're a young adult or not. But you have little to no money when you're young, right? Maybe you're in school, just got out of school. You got school debt, school loans. You got credit card debt. I don't know. You don't know how to put those debts in the offering plate. You would if you could, but you're a young couple, young family. You're trying to raise your family. Man, I don't know if you've realized it or not. The world's not getting cheaper. It's getting more and more expensive. And as you start off in life, like, you didn't really realize how little distance a dollar would carry you. And so it's easy when you're poor and you're not making that much money and you've got all this stuff you're trying to pay, you're just getting used to trying to live and take care of, you think, well, none of this applies to me because I don't have any money. Well, let me give you a little life insight from Uncle Nathan, and hopefully it won't sound condescending, but it was easier to be generous back when I was single and had no money than it is now. And it probably shouldn't be that way, and maybe it sounds ironic, but it's true. Life felt so much simpler back then. I mean, when I was in college, I didn't have kids to think about, or college tuitions to save for, or activities and driving kids around and paying for gas 3 times a week. I could furnish my whole apartment with a futon. No lie, I had a futon for years, right? Somebody had left it in the hallway in the college days. I picked it up, added it to my apartment. It was my couch, my bed, and my dining room seating all in one. Futon was awesome, by the way, Swiss Army knife of furniture. But then one day you get married and your wife says, we need more than this futon. We need a real couch and a real bed and a real dining room table and chairs. And she rules out the consideration of anything you found on the side of the road, which feels unfair. But you find yourself in IKEA spending more money than you even thought possible on a couch. And then a few later, she says, we need to replace this couch because it doesn't really fit the vibe that we're going for. And I'm like, vibe? I don't know what that means. I just need a place to sit and eat my Totino's pizza while I watch football. But next thing you know, you're at Pottery Barn taking out a second mortgage to buy something called a sectional. And when I was in college, I had no idea any of that stuff existed, right? Or dishes in college. My dishes were a mix of paper plates, the back of a pizza box, the one pan we had that had never actually been cleaned. Basically anything with a flat surface we could use to eat, right? I didn't know that you had to have matching dishes and even better sets that go with the seasons, and summer dishes and Christmas plates and Easter bunny plate, whatever, that you only use once a year. The point is, as you get older, you get more and more responsibilities and more bills, and And trust me, I haven't just seen this in my own life. I've seen this with so many people. If you don't establish generous habits early, it gets a lot harder to start them later. Same thing, by the way, with planning ahead and saving. It's the same principle. You think, oh, when I make this much money, then I'll really start saving. And it's just not true. If you don't start building those habits in, you won't. Jenna and I made a decision early in our marriage, in the futon days. We made a decision to give and to give sacrificially. We said never less than 10%. And that was when we had almost no marginal money. And it was hard. And then we made a decision that as God increased our income and as she was able to work, as our kids got older, we increased the size of our sacrifice, which meant not just increasing the amount we gave, but we increased the percentage of our budget that amount represented. And we've tried to move up year over year. And believe it or not, that's been an even harder decision. You know, studies, they do all these church statistics and giving statistics. The studies actually show that Christians making less than $45,000 a year are twice as likely to tithe as those who make more than $150,000. Let me say that again for those of you in the back. Studies show that Christians making less than $45,000 are twice as likely to tithe as those who make more than $150,000. What does that tell you? It's not about the amount. Being rich in generosity has nothing to do with how much money you have. These churches in northern Greece, in Macedonia, were in extreme poverty, and yet they overflowed with a wealth of generosity. So this leads me to that second myth, that only rich people can be happy. Again, Paul points to these Christians as the case study. They're in extreme poverty, and yet they're really happy. Why? Because of their generosity. Again, so many studies in our day show this to be true, both inside and outside the church. One recent one, for example, done inside the church showed that high generosity people were 74% more satisfied with life, nearly 3 times as likely to say they were very happy every day. Another study done by the Harvard Business Review outside the church said that significant financial generosity is one of the top 6 predictors of life satisfaction anywhere around the world. Is that surprising to you? It shouldn't be. Jesus said it very plainly. It is more blessed, literally happier, the Greek word there, makarios, literally means happier. It is happier to give than it is to receive. It is happier to give than to receive. Again, every study ever done on this, secular or Christian, shows that the happiest people in the world are the generous. Those who understand generosity. Why is that? Well, I'll tell you why that is. Because you and I were made in the image of God. And God is a generous God. And when you live and act consistent with that image, you experience the joy of being like him. And that's true even if you're not a Christian. Even if you're not a Christian, you find joy in acting in accordance with your design. Our joy in generosity is one of the small hints that we're made in the image of God and not the product of evolution. I think the best illustration of this comes from my favorite Christmas movie, favorite right behind Die Hard, of course, but I'm going to give this illustration even though it's far too early for a Christmas illustration. We're not even to summer yet, but it's an olive branch to those psychos who start celebrating Christmas before Halloween. But you guys know the movie The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, right? The Grinch is someone who is fabulously rich, but also deeply unhappy, right? You know the story. And to explain this strange creature, Dr. Seuss says, it could be his head wasn't screwed on just right. It could be perhaps his shoes were too tight. But I think the most likely reason of all may have been that his heart was 2 sizes too small. I think that'll preach. Because the reason you're unhappy, the reason you think you're unhappy is you need new shoes or a new job, some new stuff. But what you really need is an enlarged heart, a God-like heart. And God uses generosity to produce that in us. Generosity actually enlarges your capacity for joy. So for those of us who are young in the room, I still consider myself in this category, we kind of tend to think that happiness is found at that next income level. That actually will take you farther from it. Generosity, a God-like heart, is how God enlarges your capacity for joy. Hear this, generosity is not something God wants from you, it's something he wants for you. It's not something he wants from you, it's something he wants for you because he knows what it's going to produce in you. It's for your good. The third reason Paul talks to them about generosity is, he says, I'm concerned about you finishing what you started. Concerned about you finishing what you've started. Look at verse 6. He says, accordingly, we urge Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. And then verse 10 through 11, he says, and in this matter, I give my judgment, this benefits you, who a year ago started not only to do this work, but also to desire to do it. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. Paul knows that when it comes to growing in this grace in particular, it's easy to start with good intentions, but never actually go through with them. Paul says it's not the intention to be generous that brings the benefit or the blessing to you, it's the follow through. I read a story this week about, some of you guys may have remembered this. It was a lady named Deborah Veal. She was the first woman to cross the Atlantic alone in a rowboat. And she didn't actually start out alone. Initially, it had been her and her husband, Andy. She's a small 5'4" woman. He was a 6'5" Olympic gold medal oarsman. But after 14 days, he had panic attacks from the ocean and he had to be rescued from the rowboat. But little Debbie continued on by herself for more than 99 days until she completed the 6,600-mile journey. It's actually an amazing story. You can go watch YouTube videos. She battled 30-foot waves, Force 8 squalls and sharks, dodged container ships that came too close for comfort. She's gone on to be a motivational speaker. She gives TED Talks. She's written a couple of books. But here's my favorite paragraph from the article. It says, the adventure-loving PE teacher turned internet entrepreneur admitted she had thought about quitting as she confronted the solitude, storms, sharks, and blazing sun. Like, yeah, no joke, right? Who wouldn't think about quitting? But then this is great. It says, friends and family who kept in touch by email helped keep her going. Let's be honest for a minute. It's a little bit of a game changer for the whole stranded at sea thing when you can update your Instagram reel while you're out there. But I mean, still quite an accomplishment. I kind of imagine how much different Gilligan's Island would have been if they'd have been able to post on social media out there. But the point is this, right? It's really easy to start something. It's harder to finish, right? It's really easy to start something. It's a lot harder to actually follow through and complete it and finish it. But what Paul is saying is the rewards come not from starting, but finishing. Her husband, Andy, is not being invited to give TED Talks and write books to tell us how he bravely started the journey. No, we want to hear from little Debbie, who actually did it. Resolving to be generous does nothing for you. It's the follow through that counts. I think about just us and our journey here as a church, First Baptist Newcastle. 3 years ago, many of you, like we did, made a decision to invest more in the kingdom and the advancement of the mission of First Baptist Newcastle. You felt led to make a 3-year pledge as a part of our Living the Vision for the Next Generation campaign. You prayed about it and committed to a number that the Lord put on your heart. Jenna and I did the same thing. The easiest part of that was putting the number down on the pledge card. I mean, that was pretty easy. That wasn't that hard. You had to write a number down. The hard part was the follow through. The hard part was the sacrifice. The hard part was actually pulling into the pocketbook, into the checkbook, into the bank account. It was letting go of that resource. But I think about it, if all that Jenna and I would have done was written a number on a pledge card, there would have been nothing rewarding in that. What's rewarding is the follow through, and now seeing, we've seen 188 people, 190 people baptized since opening this building, right here. Some of you in this room. That's the rewarding part, is seeing God work through the investment. That's the joy that comes back. I always tell people an emotional response, and this goes with giving, this goes with any kind of obedience. An emotional response in a sermon doesn't do anything. You have to make a plan. You have to actually put feet to that plan, action to that plan. I think about when it comes to giving, you actually have to sit down and look at your budget, your calendar, and put a plan. Dave Ramsey, I don't love everything he says, but there's so much good in his financial peace study. We've taught it and taken groups through it. We'll do more in the future, but he always says this: if you don't tell your money where to go, you'll end up wondering where it went. And that's so true, right? If you don't tell it where to go, you'll end up wondering where it went. You have to make a plan, then you have to act on that plan. And I believe you should do it at the beginning of each month. I believe that's a part of fulfilling this idea. I talked about this Sunday of first and best, first fruits. In other words, do your generosity first thing in the month. I'll tell you why I think that's important. I think it's important because I think it does a couple of things for your heart that almost nothing else can do. First, I think it teaches us what comes first. I think it's a tangible way to say God comes first in my life, in my family, in our home. Our God gets our first and he gets our best, not our leftovers. Again, this isn't a legalism thing, but I think it's a great way to symbolize that and remind ourselves of that. I think it gives you a great chance to trust him. I think about this. I wish I could do this. We're not able to do this, but there was a brother that shared with me one time when it came to giving. He gives everything he makes in the month of January, first month of the year. Everything he makes in the month of January, gives it all to the Lord. And I began to think about that concept because here's what it forces him to do. It forces him, one, to plan well that year for January coming the next year, because he knows I'm giving my first month everything I make to the Lord. So I got a plan. But it also forces him to trust the Lord. You know, we've all been there, right? Where it's like, man, the budget is tight. I don't know if we'll have enough left over to make ends meet. Well, I just challenge you, test God and see. Because in Malachi chapter 3, verse 10, it's one of the only times he uses language like this: test me in this and see if I'm faithful. I promise you'll find him faithful. I hear story after story in our church of how people begin to be obedient and follow the Lord in this, and they find God faithful time and time again. One of my favorite illustrations is from David Jeremiah. If any of you guys have ever listened to David Jeremiah preach, he's a pastor out in California. He said a couple in his church came to him and they told him, hey, we want to obey God, but we just can't afford to tithe. We can't afford to give. And he said, I'll tell you what. He said, write out the check for whatever the tithe would be. And he said, give that to me. He said, but I'll put it in my desk drawer and I won't turn it in until the end of the month. And here's the thing. If at the end of the month you can't pay your bills, he said, just tell me and I'll give it back to you and not cash it. He said to the couple, he said, does that sound reasonable? Would you trust me to do that? And they looked at each other and nodded and said, yes, we trust you with that. And then Dr. Jeremiah said with a twinkle in his eye, well, shame on you. It seems you trust me more than God. Mic drop, right? Like, I'm not going to do that to you. I'm nicer. But see, what his point was this. Tithing, giving is ultimately a trust test. It's not a financial test. Like, I get it, right? Economy's unstable. It's not easy to be generous. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone next week, next month. Your premiums might jump. You might get laid off. Who knows what will happen with the stock market, oil, war in Iran. But listen, generosity is not a declaration of confidence in your financial future. It's not a declaration of confidence in the U.S. market or economy. Generosity is a declaration of confidence in a God bigger than your financial future and more stable than the stablest economy. The point is, it's not the intention to start that counts. It's time to stop talking about it and acting and being obedient. So maybe at this point you're like, okay, Pastor, I'm with you. I want to do this, but how? I've made good intentions before. How do I know I won't quit again? How do I know I won't walk out of here and have a good intention, but not follow through? Well, I think Paul hears that. And so in the last part of this chapter, he identifies a handful of things that sabotage our good intentions, things that turn us back, and I want to present them as a series of stops and starts. 2 stops, 2 starts, all right, to close out tonight. Stop number 1. Look at verse 12. Stop worrying about the amount. Look at verse 12. He says, for if the readiness is there, it is acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what he does not have. He says, if the readiness, he's talking about to give, is there, right? If your attitude before God is there and it's acceptable, it's not about the amount. We give according to what we have, not according to what we don't have. That's the NTP version, by the way. I combined a couple of translations there, right? It's not about the amount. We give according to what we have, not according to what we do not have. What God cares about is the heart, the readiness, the eagerness to give. You see, a lot of people feel guilty because they don't have that much to give. Maybe you hear people tell stories about giving and you think, oh man, I can't give like that. I'll never be able to, I can't even dream of giving like that. I'm so poor that even my dreams are on a budget, right? I'm so poor that the first item on my bucket list is to save enough money to buy a bucket. Listen, God could care less about the amount. It's never about the amount. God doesn't approach us with these price tagged needs that he expects us to supply. God's not up in heaven going, oh, there are so many great things I want to do in the world. If only the people of FBCN would spare me a little startup capital. No, God cares about our hearts. You can't give what you don't have. What is important is that your heart resembles his heart. And if that's true, you'll share generously from what you have. It's less about the amount you supply for God and more about what the amount signifies about your heart toward God. So stop worrying about the amount. That's the first stop. The first start is start sharing in suffering. Look at verse 13 and 14. He says, for I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, but that as a matter of fairness, your abundance at the present time should supply their need, so that their abundance may supply your need, that there may be fairness. Start sharing in suffering. Now, pay attention to this. This is really important. It's the heart of love, grace-based giving, and this insight helped me so much. Paul is saying, I'm not asking you to take on the responsibility of everyone else's needs. You can't do that, right? Not one of us in here could take on the needs of the entire church. You can't do that. But what he is saying is that when you love someone, you'll use whatever you have to share in their needs, because that's what love is, right? When you love someone, you step into their pain. You enter into their pain. You hurt with them. When someone you love is hurting emotionally, what do? You enter into that emotional pain and you share in it. When my kids hurt, I hurt with them, not because I have to, but because I can't not do that. If you don't enter into the hurt, then you don't really love them. Love-based giving is when you give to the point that you share in the person's hurt. You guys know of C.S. Lewis, right? This is in his book, Mere Christianity, by the way, and if you've never read it, it's a great, great classic read. It helped me in so many ways, but especially on a practical level. He calls this the only safe rule of giving. He says, giving more than you think you can spare. Here's the actual quote. He says, I do not believe one can settle how much we ought to give, which that's always the question that everybody asks. Pastor, just tell me the amount. How much? Tell me the amount. No, C.S. Lewis says, I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. This is what C.S. Lewis says, because he's saying only when you actually inconvenience your life are you sharing in someone's pain, which is the essence of love, taking someone else's pain into yourself. Only then are you loving like God. By the way, C.S. Lewis actually lived this out himself. I don't know if you know this about him, but he was one of the most prolific authors of the 20th century, the J.K. Rowling of his generation. But Lewis never made any money on his books. He literally gave all of it away. He really believed that he could live on enough and be generous with the rest. So that's the first stop and the first start. Second stop, stop thinking like an atheist. Look at verse 15. He says, as it is written, whoever gathered much has nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Well, what's he talking about here? Well, this is a quote from Exodus chapter 16. If you're familiar with your Old Testament, you know the story of how God provided manna for his people in the wilderness after they had left Egypt. And I'll just give you the cliff notes here. They were in the wilderness. They couldn't get food for themselves. They didn't have land, and they weren't growing crops. They had no way to feed themselves. And so every night, what would God do? Well, miraculously, he would rain down from heaven this stuff called manna. And each morning when the people of God woke up, the ground was covered in manna. Based on the description that Exodus gives, it kind of seems like it was a mix between falafel and a protein bar. This manna was provided daily for the people of God. And people back then were just like people today. So what did they do? They wanted to stockpile a little extra, right? Like what if they woke up tomorrow morning and there wasn't manna and there's a bunch today? So they would stockpile it. But God said, that's opposite of how I want you to think. I want you to trust that I'll be there tomorrow to provide for your needs just like I was today. And here's the key. He says, I want you to express that by gathering only enough for today and sharing any excess from today with those who don't have enough today. So to drive home this point, God caused whatever excess they secretly stockpiled to rot, breed worms, and stink. So think about being in this situation. You're a Hebrew dad or a Hebrew mom, goes out in the morning, collects a bunch of manna for the day. By lunch, it's clear, man, we got enough, more than enough for our family. You've made everything you can make with manna, manicotti, peanut butter and banana sandwiches, banana bread. These puns never get old. I could keep going. But still, you have some left over, right? And you notice there's some other family over there that for whatever reason, they didn't gather enough for the day. Maybe they were sick. Maybe they overslept. Whatever reason, they're short and you have excess. Well, you might as well go ahead and share the extra manna you have, because tomorrow God's going to supply whatever you need for that day. And whatever you gather is just going to go bad tonight anyway. So when you trust that the God who provided you for you today will be there to provide for you tomorrow, that's how you begin to think, right? But when you don't think that way, what do? You hoard and you refuse to share because you're afraid that tomorrow there won't be a God to provide for you. Well, functionally, you're thinking like an atheist. Paul says, don't think like that. He says, don't think like that. The God who provided you for you today will provide for you tomorrow. And he wants you to use whatever excess he's given to you today to meet the needs around you today. That's what he's saying. Now, let me be clear here before somebody goes, oh, Pastor Nathan was saying that he's against saving and wise planning and retirement and all this stuff. No. The book of Proverbs commends in at least 6 different places that I know of that it is wise to save, that a fool doesn't plan for the future. But we hold these things together. The Bible also teaches that you should respond to the needs and kingdom opportunities in front of you today because we're not promised tomorrow. So let me just say this very clearly. For many of us, saving has become a replacement for trust in God. And that's evident by how we ignore the needs and opportunities God puts in front of us today. We won't give generously today because we're afraid we might be in a situation tomorrow where God won't provide. And that's thinking like an atheist. You're only comfortable when you have enough money in the bank that you can say, I don't need God for the future. I have all that I need right here. Now, of course, no one says this verbally, but it's what whispers in the secret places of your heart. Functionally, you're believing and thinking like an atheist. And as with the manna, that has a rotting effect on the soul. And it makes you stink, and everybody else smells it. You're greedy, you're stingy, you're fearful, you're worried. It just stinks. So you say, well, what are you saying, Pastor? I'm confused. Should we save or not save? Yes, save. Absolutely plan for the future, but not in a way that keeps you from meeting the needs and opportunities God puts in front of you today. So let me end tonight with one last start. Stop worrying about the amount. Start sharing in suffering. Stop thinking like an atheist. Finally, most important, start contemplating the gospel. Look at verse 9. Back to the, I think, the key verse in this entire section. He says, For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. This is an incredible, majestic verse, the gospel right here in one verse. The gospel is not about a God who approaches us with needs. No, he's the giver, we're the receiver. We see this most clearly in our salvation. We were unspeakably poor. He was indescribably rich. He lavished such an incredible grace on us. He poured himself out so completely for us that it made even the angels stand in wonder, awestruck, hands over their mouths. They couldn't believe it. So Paul's not talking about throwing in a little bit of your lunch money in the offering box because of a high-pressure timeshare guilt trip. He's talking about a whole reorientation of your life around the grace of God. Make your experience with God's grace the entire foundation and the shaping reality of your life. You're not an atheist who's unsure if there's a God who will provide for your future. You know an extravagantly generous God who loved you when you were his enemy, who died in your place and promises to never leave you or forsake you. He will be there for you tomorrow and then the next day and the next day and every day for the rest of your eternity. So if all you do in response to a message like this, a text like this, is give a little bit or make a few resolutions about generosity, it won't survive until the end of the week. But if you reorient your life around the grace of God, you'll flourish in the grace for the rest of your life. Oh, you excel at other graces, Paul says, excel in this grace too. Here's the illustration I'll close with tonight. I'm really not good with plants and flowers and growing things. If you come over to our house, you'll see that in our front flower bed. Growing up, though, my mom loved to garden, and she was always out working in the flower beds and weeding, planting, adding plants each season. And one day, as a part of my chores, she told me to go out and weed a flower bed that had gotten a little bit out of control, that she had not had the time to. She had 12 kids, by the way, so I mean, she was pretty busy. So she sent me out, and reluctantly I headed out to take care of the weeds. And you may know this, but there are two ways to kill weeds. You can get on your knees and spend several hours pulling them up by the roots, which is apparently the correct way, or you can napalm the whole bed with Roundup, and which was my way. And I blasted our flower beds with weed killer, got it out of the shed in the back, and all the weeds died, just like the advertisement promised, but so did all my mom's rose bushes. And needless to say, that was a bad week for me. But for the sake of this illustration, let's say that after the Roundup did its job, to make my mom happy again, let's say I just went down to the florist and bought several dozen roses and brought them home and began stapling them to the dead branches of the rose bushes. Well, would that have fixed anything? Well, maybe for a while those dead rose bushes would have looked alive, at least from a distance. Like if you were driving past our house at 35 miles per hour, things would have looked fine. But in reality, stapling roses to a dead rose bush doesn't make the bush alive again. And I think this is where a lot of people live spiritually. Constantly kind of like trying to add spiritual fruit to their lives like, oh, okay, I heard a message on giving, so yeah, I'll give I'll give tonight, or I'll give next Sunday, or I'll give for a week or a month. I'll add the thing. I heard a message on evangelism, so I'll really try to share the gospel once this week or this month. Or I heard a message on, I'm supposed to be reading my Bible, so okay, I'll get back to. They're constantly trying to add the fruit, grab the pieces of fruit and add it to the tree, and constantly going back over dead bushes, stapling fake flowers to themselves. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, that's exhausting. It's exhausting. It is. There's a better way. There's a better way. Paul says, 2 Corinthians 8:9, put your roots down in the gospel and soak in the awareness of how much compassion and grace God has shown you. Think about where you'd be without Jesus, where you'd be had he left you to what you deserve. I think about, I preached it this last week in Romans chapter 11, right? He grafts us in. The power doesn't come from us feverishly trying to add these things to our lives. Oh man, I heard Nathan say I need to give, so I'm going to go. No. The power comes from sinking our roots deep into the gospel, into Jesus, making sure that we've been grafted into the tree and that our fruit flows from the inside out, not from trying to staple the flowers to a dead bush. So if you leave here tonight thinking, I just need to give more, I need to give this week, or I need to give, that's not what Paul's saying. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, you know the grace of our Lord, that though he was rich, yet for your sake became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. You need to soak in that truth, in that grace. And I'm telling you, as you do that, it will produce the fruit in you.